Coming up on The World Today. The World Health Organization advises that the world should maintain the 14-day quarantine period for the coronavirus to help keep the number of infections down. Meanwhile, the United Nations calls for the world to unite to meet the various challenges posed by the pandemic. Plus, the first half of former U.S. President Barack Obama's memoirs are set to be released on November 17. A warm welcome to the program. I'm Akaite Afia. The World Health Organization says the 14-day quarantine period for anyone exposed to the coronavirus should remain in place and should not be changed. Now, this comes as the Global Health Agency warns of a very serious situation emerging in Europe. The recommendation is based on scientific understanding of the virus's incubation period and transmission. Here's the global update.
The WHO's warning on the quarantine period for the coronavirus comes as it also says roughly 1 in 7 cases of COVID-19 reported to the agency are among health workers, and in some countries that rises to 1 in 3. It has called for frontline workers to be provided with protective equipment to prevent them from being infected with the Nobel coronavirus and potentially spreading it to their patients and families.
Globally, around 14% of COVID-19 cases reported to WHO are among health workers, and in some countries it's as much as 35%. Although data are limited and it's hard to know whether health workers are infected in their workplaces or communities. It's not just the risk of infection. Every day, health workers are exposed to stress, burnout, stigma, discrimination, and even violence.
John? Yes.
Meanwhile, in the UK, Health Secretary Matt Hancock says areas of northeast England will be subject to further COVID-19 lockdown restrictions as coronavirus cases surge. People will no longer be able to mix with other households, and pubs will have to close early, according to measures that will be in place from midnight. Residents across the country have been struggling to access the COVID-19 testing system after a rise in cases and demand for the tests.
Earlier this month, Tameside and Glossop ceased.
In other parts of Europe, Italy for instance, airline Alitalia has launched 2 coronavirus-free flights a day, where passengers are offered a COVID-19 test at the airport before flying that gives a result in 30 minutes. Passengers can only travel on flights from Rome's Fiumicino Airport to Milan's Linate if they can prove they have tested negative, either by taking the airport's rapid nasal swab test before they board or with a certificate showing that they have tested negative within 72 hours before flying. And in France, several hundred workers at COVID-19 testing laboratories across the country have embarked on a strike action, protesting poor working conditions, piling more strain on the system under severe stress. The strike is said to be disrupting testing in some towns and could drag on if laboratory owners failed to negotiate, just as the government demands more and faster testing to help fight a surge in new coronavirus cases. Spain's Madrid region says it is planning to introduce targeted lockdowns due to rising coronavirus cases. Head of Health Enrique Ruiz Escudero says details of the lockdown will be released on Friday, though he recognized Madrid is in a situation of sustained infection growth. The city accounts for around 1/3 of active coronavirus cases in the country, with a higher incidence in high-density and low-income neighborhoods, mainly in the south of the capital. In Thailand, the country's military-backed Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-o-cha has warned protesters against heightened COVID-19 risks as they plan large anti-government demonstrations for the weekend. Demonstrators have held 2 months of near-daily rallies to demand that the former junta leader and Prime Minister be removed and that there be changes to the constitution that they say was designed to extend military dominance after an election last year. Finally, the total number of coronavirus cases in the United States are, however, still on the rise, having surpassed 6.62 million, according to the Center for Systems Science and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University, while death toll is only inches away from 200,000, which could go higher by the end of the day. Meanwhile, the Federal Health Emergency Management Agency says that the country has seen a 17% increase in confirmed deaths from COVID-19 in 1 week.
Russian authorities have begun administering their coronavirus vaccine to volunteers. A head researcher at the Moscow clinic where it is being administered says the vaccine is made of two components. First, a patient gets a shot of the first one after screening, and in 21 days, the patient gets the second shot. The first shot is expected to begin to produce antibodies, while the second strengthens the effects of it. However, the nation's health minister, Mikhail Murashko, says nearly 14% of patients who have been administered Sputnik V vaccine have reported suffering from side effects. 1 in 7 volunteers have complained of side effects, including weakness and muscle pain after taking the vaccine. The complications are, however, described as predictable. Most adverse events were mild and no serious events were detected within 43 days of vaccination. The two-part vaccine includes 2 adenovirus vectors, recombinant human adenovirus type 26 and recombinant human adenovirus type 5, which have been modified to express the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. Meanwhile, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the international community must unite and meet the various challenges posed by the global pandemic and climate change. He says this during a press conference in preparation for the UN's 75th anniversary this year. Mr. Guterres warned that the organization faces its own 1945 moment, noting that efforts must be made to meet that moment.
75th anniversary year, we face our own 1945 moment. We must meet that moment, and we must show unity like never before to overcome today's emergency, get the world moving and working and prospering again, and uphold the vision of the Charter.
More than 70 migrants today jumped into the sea from the Spanish rescue ship Open Arms in an attempt to swim to the nearby southern Italian coast of Palermo after 9 days on board. Crew on the ship said the migrants jumped overboard after the situation on board deteriorated, while they waited for instructions of where they would be allowed to disembark. The total of 278 migrants were rescued between September 8th through 10th during these rescue operations. Greek police on the island of Lesbos have been helping to move homeless migrants into a temporary tent camp after many resisted entering the new facility following recent fires. One source says no force would be used in the ongoing operation, which could take days. It has been a week since the Moria camp burned down, ousting more than 12,000 people. Many have been sleeping on the streets, in parking lots, and in forests in the hopes of leaving Lesbos for other European countries. Authorities had encouraged migrants to enter the new makeshift camp, saying if any transfer from Lesbos took place, they would be organized from within the camp. More revelations are emerging from the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. First, we have learned a Novichok nerve agent was used, and now we are learning how. The nerve agent was detected on an empty water bottle from his hotel room in the Siberian city of Tomsk, suggesting he was poisoned there and not at the airport as earlier thought. Navalny fell violently ill while a domestic flight in Russia and was subsequently airlifted to Berlin for treatment. The doctors in Germany were the first to detect the Novichok nerve agent, and with fingers pointing at Russia, the country has denied it, saying there is no evidence Navalny was poisoned. This week, Navalny and his team posted a video on his Instagram account as they searched the room he had just left in the Xander Hotel in Tomsk on August 20th. An hour later, they learned he had fallen sick in suspicious circumstances. Russia has carried out pre-investigation checks, but says it needs to see more medical analysis before it can open a formal criminal investigation into the case. EU Parliament members have approved a resolution calling for an international investigation into Navalny's poisoning. Following a debate on September 15th, lawmakers adopted the non-binding resolution with 532 votes in favor, 84 against, and 72 abstentions. In the resolution, the EU parliamentary body said the poisoning of Navalny was part of a systemic effort to silence the voices in Russia.
There is now irrefutable evidence that a nerve agent of the Novichok group, similar to the one used in the assassination attempt on Sergei and also on Yulia Skripal on the past March 2018, was used to try to assassinate Mr. Navalny.
Politkovskaya, Magnitsky, Litvinenko, Nemtsov, Skripal, opponents to Kremlin, victims of Kremlin. And now Alexei Navalny poisoned with military-grade nerve agent Novichok. It is time to stop Putin's impunity. It is time to impose broader sectoral sanctions. Let us start with stopping Nord Stream 2. Thank you.
Meanwhile, the European Parliament has agreed that Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko should no longer be recognized as president from November when his term expires. They have also called for the European Union economic sanctions to be imposed on him. In an overwhelming show of support for pro-democracy protesters in the country, the EU Assembly voted 574 to 37 with 82 abstentions to reject the official results of an August 9th presidential election the West says was rigged.
From my point of view, the rerun of elections under OSCE supervision would be the best solution, but so far it has been impossible for us to reach out to Belarus authorities at any level. The single-minded determination of Lukashenko to stay in power with the apparent increasingly support of Moscow makes all this difficult.
Dank, Frau Kollegin Piri.
Well, let's switch gears to Africa as depicted as a hero in the Hollywood movie about Rwanda's 1994 genocide. Paul Rusesabagina has been denied bail, though promised not to escape. Rusesabagina applied for bail after being charged earlier in the week with terrorism, forming or joining an irregular armed group, and complicity in murder. His trial and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his appearance in Rwanda after years in exile are also shining a spotlight on political opposition to President Paul Kagame, which stands accused by rights groups of stifling dissent. Some in Rwanda, including President Kagame, have accused Rusesabagina of exaggerating his heroism, which he denies. Well, apart from supporting the Democratic presidential nominee in the upcoming elections, what else has former U.S. President Barack Obama been up to? Well, apparently writing. The former president has been writing his memoirs. The first half of it is set to be released on November 17th, 2 weeks after the U.S. presidential election. The 768-page memoir will be simultaneously issued in 25 languages and will be about the response to the global financial crisis, his landmark healthcare reform legislation known as the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, and the 2011 U.S. raid in Pakistan that killed al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. But it won't be the former president's first publication. He has written 3 already, including Dreams of My Father and The Audacity of Hope, as well as the children's book Of Thee I Sing. Mr. Obama says the book would try to provide an honest account of his presidency. Still ahead on The World Today. Nobel fever hits as guesses rise for who could win the Nobel Peace Prize. Could it be Green campaigner Greta Thunberg? Well, some people think so. We'll tell you all about it when we return. Thanks so much for staying with us. You're watching The World Today on Channels Television. Well, as we earlier mentioned, former U.S. President Barack Obama has been writing his memoirs, which is set to release on November 17th, just 2 weeks after the U.S. presidential election. We have our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird, joining us now on the program. Maria, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So this is apparently the year of books, expository books, I should add, especially about the elections and all the players involved. So could that also characterize the former president's new book?
That is so true. These memoirs are probably going to highlight the areas of his administration as well. And so obviously, as you stated, this is coming out November 17th. And so that is strategically after the election, hoping to not, impact any of the results of the election with his memoirs. Obviously, we know that over the past 3 years now, President Trump has made some very serious allegations against the previous administration. And so I'm sure this will explain some of that as well. I'm not saying it's going to come out in defense of some of those allegations, but it will explain the administration and the president, this administration, Barack Obama.
Well, speaking of the elections, apart from the Democratic convention, we find that the former president has been quite calculated with being involved in the elections. We know he has only openly declared support for Joe Biden, the party's candidate, but has he really been involved in his campaign, even though this may have been hampered by the coronavirus pandemic?
Of course, it has been hampered by the coronavirus pandemic. I think there's a lot happening right now in the United States. You have issues of systemic racism, you have issues of the coronavirus pandemic. And so those two very serious issues that are happening across the country. And again, he has his foundation that are occurring. He has spent lots of time. I mean, we know even when the NBA decided to go on strike due to the Black Lives Matter movement, he was consulted on that decision for them to even begin to replay. So he has his plate quite full at this time, but it's clear he has supported presidential candidate Joe Biden for the Democratic Party. But again, with us not seeing traditional campaigning, it's hard to say if he has really alleviated himself or removed himself from campaigning, or if it is just a result of where we are today as a country.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the release date for the memoirs. November 17th is just 2 weeks after the presidential election. So how significant is this, and what do you think the former president was trying to achieve with this timing?
Well, this is strategic in several ways. One, he does not want to impact or potentially harm the Democratic candidate Joe Biden with this memoir, because there's going to be people, obviously, that are on the fence. And maybe they're not President Obama fans. And so he does not want to at all have any type of potential sway on the voters, potentially not going toward the Democratic Party. And so he's hopeful that this will, at that time, be appropriate, because we will then know the result of the election, and it will allow for people to really understand what has happened during his administration, and really give some insight into where the country will be going or where the country is headed. And essentially also give some answers to what we've seen over the last 4 years. So he does not want to at all hurt the presidential candidate Joe Biden by the memoir coming out.
All right. Well, Maria, thanks again so much for joining us today. Please stay safe.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, pain is not an emotion that everyone is known to express creatively, and we must give it up for those who can. People like 42-year-old Ahmad Shirzad, who picked up a brush and started painting as a way of expressing the pain and hardship he and other migrants on Lesbos have faced. Many had to leave the camp following the fires that engulfed the place last week, leaving them to fend for themselves on the streets without proper shelter, sanitation, food, or water. While he lived in the Maria facility, he taught art lessons to the refugee children in a makeshift school set up by one of his compatriots. He lost all of his artwork in the fire last week, as well as his supplies. But Ahmad has got some good friends who went on the island's main town to buy him new supplies. In his most recent works, he has been depicting the charred ruins of Moria camp on his canvas, the plight of families with children, and running to escape. Many around the world have their fingers crossed that their favorite candidates would win the Nobel Peace Prize this year. Experts are touting Greener Campaign, Greta Thunberg, and the Fridays for the Future movement that highlight the link between environmental damage and the threat to peace and security. The 17-year-old Swede was nominated by 3 Norwegian lawmakers and 2 Swedish parliaments, and if she wins, she would receive it at the same age as Pakistan's Malala Yousafzai, the youngest Nobel laureate thus far. The committee has given the prize to environmentalists before, starting with Kenya's Wangari Maathai in 2004 for her campaign to plant 30 million trees across Africa, and in 2007 to Al Gore and the International Panel on Climate Change. The winner of the $1 million prize, arguably the world's top accolade, will be announced in Oslo on October 9th out of 318 candidates and can be split up into 3 ways. All right, well, that's all for the world today. Thank you so much for staying with us. I'm Akaite Afia.